Okay. Hi again. My name is Xiao Yue, and I'm a technical artist from Epic Games China. And I'm here today to share some tips and tricks about chaos distraction. Let's just get started. So the overarching goal for my topic today is to explore how to make chaos distraction more believable and more controllable. By believable, I'm referring to make the effect more realistic, and I'll dive into this from two aspects: the overall shape control of the shattered chunks and the secondary elements driven by them. As for controllable, I mean to control how it breaks during gameplay and at the same time keep it performant, which is always the key component. We start from the believable looks. First, let's think about what elements a distraction contains. A static mesh with a collision proxy can run through a rigid body simulation in Unreal, we all know that. But to break it, we need to fracture it beforehand, constrain the pieces together, and break some of the inner connections at runtime. And in Unreal, we use geometry collection to describe breakable objects, and we can easily convert one or multiple static meshes into a geometry collection and edit it in the fracture mode. Fracture a single slab is pretty straightforward, but for large-scale distractions, we need to consider structures. For example, this house model, I bought it on Patreon, and I'm going to use this as a demonstration throughout today's speech. If we want to destroy the entire structure, we need to organize the pieces hierarchically and break them from large to small progressively. So by turning the debug jaw on the right, you can see the activated part. This is the part that's truly engaged in the rigid body simulation in the whole effect. However, we know that real distraction encompasses far more than just that. It also includes a large portion of debris, dust, veils of smoke, as well as deformations and cracks on the surface of objects. All of that cannot be described using rigid bodies. We need to drive a series of secondary elements to complete the effect. Niagara can seamlessly interact with chaos, and typically we emit smaller meshes and smoke flip books once the rigid body breaks or collides. But if your performance budget is high enough, you can even perform fluid simulation based on this chaos solver data. And this will take to the visual to the next level of realism because it involves real collisions between fluids and the rigid body, and its real volume rendering. Now we listed all the visual elements. Let's see how we can make it more believable in Unreal. Let's start with the coarse shape control, or how we slice a solid object into chunks. Whether it's in Unreal or other DCC like Houdini, Maya Max, the basic approach isn't that different. You either generate a Voronoi diagram or you perform Boolean operation with another geometry. The Voronoi diagram divides a model based on the distance to seed point, or size. That's what we call in Unreal. And so the key here is to control the distribution of these sides. Area with denser distribution will yield smaller and more fragmented chunks. And if we observe the fracture patterns in nature, the contrast in chunk sizes can be quite significant. So it is essential to focus on these variations. As for Boolean fracture, it uses another model to perform Boolean operation with the original one. And in comparison, the result is more predictable as it gives artists precise control of the fractured contour, and our focus then shifts to control the shape of the cutter. Unreal provides several options for each method in the fracture edit mode, and you can refer to the link below. It provides detailed instructions and examples for all the options I listed, so I won't elaborate here. However, when consider which approach to choose, I'd like to emphasize one point. So you should always think about the true material of the object. Is it made of concrete or wood or glass? And if you look at the references, you'll notice that each material has distinct contour and patterns. You should apply appropriate method accordingly. For example, if it's made of concrete, it won't have like sharp edges. And adding some noise on the edge can give it a more organic look. And additionally, the fracture tool in Unreal has a grunt option. It will create like a channel between the large chunks, and then you can create like smaller pieces in between. Because that's what happened in nature. Cracking area always generate like detailed debris. And for most wood material, the wood grain always run along a specific direction. A common technique I always use is to first shrink the object down along the grain axis, fracture it, and then stretch it back. This can give us like a splintered look. Okay. As for glass, some of you may know we have a radial fracture. It really fits glass, but often in games, we usually don't know the impact position beforehand. And in my practice, performing like multiple slides iteratively also creates like sharp edges or sharp angles, which also looks like glass. In addition to the general pattern of the chunks, the interior detail is also very important to the final look. Firstly, we have the auto UV and auto beacon tool that can assist with like making interior material. And you can see in the top image, the thickness info can help layering the textures, indicating the complex ingredient this material is made of. And if you want another layer of visual complexity, you can attach additional geometry on the simulated one. And it will be just for rendering. It won't participate in the actual simulation. And in the old Matrix project, when the large bridge collapses, you can see the detailed like internal structure, like rebars and little racks. This embedded geometry really enriched the whole look. Again, more details on the link below. And that's about it for the overall shape control for the large chunks. Let's take a look at the smaller but just the same important secondary element. First question, how to drive it? In Unreal, Chaos can collect solver data and copy them to buffers. Then in Niagara, we have a data interface reads and filter these buffers and generate spawn info based on it. There are a few settings you need to be aware of. First, you need to enable this chaos data generation in the project settings. Then on the geometry collection component you want to record, you need to turn on event notification. And when the corresponding event occurs, such as when the object breaks or collide with each other, you can emit particles at the right spot and inherit some amount of the rigid body's velocity. And you can also get other informations like collision normals, restitution, friction, all the physical properties you may need. And it's not just for the effect system. You can also bind some blueprint logic to the chaos callbacks. We had a question from our client in China. Some people don't want the broken pieces to interfere with the player's movement. So what you can do here is on this chaos event, you get the ID of the broken bones and modify its collision profile individually at runtime, so they won't collide with the player once they are fallen. Sorry. Okay, returning to the subject of secondary effects. Just like fracturing, a crucial aspect in achieving realism is to respect different materials. Most of the time, we can categorize them by surface type defined in their physical material. And if it's a gunfire, you can get the surface type through the hit result. And if it's from the chaos solver data, you can set a surface type filter or a physical material filter on the Niagara data interface and use different emitters to handle them. The easiest thing to think of is simply instance different meshes or sprites on these particles. And just like in the video, you can easily tell the difference between like it's hitting the floor or the wooden plank and or the window glass. Sorry, that's loud. Okay, dealing with metal and glass is a bit tricky here because it's not just about spawning different particles. Different material responses plays a vital role here. Luckily, Niagara allows us to write out render targets, which make it really easy to integrate with other like spawning visuals. In this case, I get the hit position in Niagara, transform it from world space to UV space, and draw a circle on a render target. And let's see how to use this mask to drive different material response. So metal always bends and deforms before it was torn apart under pressure. So we should focus on making like nice bullet holes and displace the mesh in the impact area. I'm just throwing out suggestions here, but you could bake a pre-made deformation on the vertex color and drive world position offset with the heat mask, then combine with some detailed normal changes or color changes. I think it's good enough already. So the visual focus of glass destruction lies in the sharp cracks. Although glass only represent like a small portion compared to the whole house, it really needs to be fractured into tiny, thin pieces to create a convincing effect. And in my experiments, simulate that much of small chunks is too expensive, and the collisions between these translucent objects really not that noticeable. So it simply doesn't seem worthwhile, and in the end, I choose a material-driven approach for the glass shattering effect. So instead of actual geometry fracturing, the crack pattern relies on a seamless Voronoi map. Note that the Voronoi position map is very useful here because it can be used to sample the heat mask and get a natural penetration area with zigzagged edges. And the heat radius is also linked to the particle spawn radius in Niagara, so it can effectively concealing the fact that it's not actually breaking apart. So I think this approach provides artists with greater flexibility and also avoid any performance issues. Okay, that's about it for the visuals. Let's talk about how to control it in-game. There are mainly two methods you can interact with geometry collection in Unreal. Actual physical collision will impact it, or you can modify its physical properties through blueprint with our field system. Yesterday's Niagara session, I talked about this before, but in short, field system is a module provide containers for these physical properties. And we use primitive shapes like spheres, boxes, and planes to define and apply these physical properties within a limited area. Videos on the right shows a typical use case of field. When the player shoots, we first apply external strain, trigger it to break, and then modify the velocity of rigid bodies inside the impact area. We have a collection of commonly used field assets in our engine content, so I won't elaborate here, but I do want to mention that it's not just limited to destruction. And one of my colleagues, a senior technical artist, Li Wenlei from China, he did a great talk about how to leverage field system to integrate with different modules like clothes, rigid bodies, Niagara, and material to create a unified look. It's in Chinese, but do check it out. I think we have auto-translate now. Okay, so no matter whether it's a collision or a field, what happens underneath is there are connections in between the neighboring chunks, each with a predefined strength. They are then compared with the impact received by each body at runtime. So the key to controlling how it breaks lies in two aspects. We need a well-defined constraint network and a reasonable physical damage model. For the artist, the construction of the constraint network is like a black box, but still there are settings to be aware of. Otherwise, you may run into problems like this. Okay, so let's first look at the left one. After the middle brick is broken, what's left is what we call a corner connection. It looks very odd, and most of the time we prefer to filter out these connections. And the right one is even stranger. There are some chunks left floating after the supporting brick is done, and that's not beautiful. And upon checking the constraint network, you can see the problem. There are unwanted connections between bricks that they are not even touching. But why is this happening? It all lies in the cluster connection type. I'm going to break it down a little bit here. So the default option for constructing the constraint network involves Voronoi diagram too. So the pivot of each chunk serves as a seeding point. However, this approach can lead to issues, especially with concave models. Like the right picture, it may connect chunks that are not actually in contact. And in Unreal 5.1, we introduce a new option called bounds overlap filtered, which checks whether the bounds of each chunk are actually overlapping. So by using this option, we can avoid most floating chunks. And in Unreal 5.2, we introduce the proximity tool. It allows for more precise filtering by using the convex hull or the precise mesh instead of just use the bounds. And additionally, we can set an area threshold to filter out cases where the corners are connected. And sorry. Okay. But anyway, after using that tool, those two problems are gone, okay? So the next question is the strength of each constraint or the damage threshold, how to set it properly. it's quite intuitive to think that break it down to different clusters requires different impact. But even at the same level, the larger one should be harder to break. We also have an option for that. And after, let's just play the video. And after 5.3, we introduce another option called material strength and connectivity. So it calculates the damage threshold by looking at all connections with the siblings and summing up the surface area, then times the tensile strength from the physical material. I think this is currently the most physical way. It should help maintain the integrity of the whole structures better, and moreover, the corner connection problem that I mentioned before won't be as prominent because of they have small contact area. And the damage doesn't stop at the contact point. They have a propagation algorithm that transmits it through the constraint network. There are two settings we need to be aware of. First, we have a break propagation, which takes the remaining damage after a chunk is broken and distributes it to its neighbors by a certain factor. And another one is called shock propagation. It passes on the damage by a factor regardless of whether the chunk breaks or not. And this can cause chunks far from the contact point but weaker to break earlier. While this makes sense, we should use it with caution because most of the time I want the breakage occur within a contained region. Okay, so we know the mechanism behind. Now let's talk about optimizations. The first thing I want to discuss is setting up clusters. It's a concept unique to rigid body simulation. You shouldn't think about it solely from an art directing point, because it is essential for stabilizing the whole simulation and keeping the frame rate acceptable. The chunks within one cluster shares a single transform, and they are treated as one rigid body during simulation, which of course can help reduce the number of active bodies. So for this house, I've divided it into nearly 4,000 fragments, but I also organized them into 4 levels. So when the collision occurs at the first level, I only need to consider the 200 top-level clusters, and their children are only taken into account after they break. And we can compare the performance with and without clusters. The frame rate drops to around 4 FPS without clustering, which is barely playable. And you can see the number of active bodies is running really high in the stats. But once they are clustered, the frame rate immediately becomes much more acceptable. And furthermore, simply clustering pieces together may not be enough. We also need to consider the complexity of the cluster's collision body. As you can see in the model's level stats, the number of bones and the number of convex collisions doesn't necessarily match. This difference occurs because when grouping several chunks together, they often form a concave shape. So when generating a convex collision for it, if the volume difference with the original model is too big, too large, it will fall back to using multiple leaf convex collisions instead. And if we don't need our collision to be that tight or that precise, it is beneficial to adjust parameters in the convex generation to enclose one cluster with one single convex hole. Let's compare the performance before and after. We can see less number of contacts when the break happens, which result in more acceptable spikes. So the performance bottleneck in rigid body simulations often lies in the collision calculations. Apart from the clustered ones, we also need to optimize all leaf collisions. Geometry collection provide other collision proxy that can be set based on their relative size of each chunk. So in terms of computational cost, spheres are more efficient than capsules, followed by boxes, and finally, convex hull. The default use of convex hull is due to their ability to minimize interpenetrations between chunks and prevent initial explosions. However, if the intended effect is exactly an explosion, or if we only use simpler collisions for the smaller ones, the smaller chunk, I think it is acceptable to deviate from using the convex hulls. So for example, if I use box for the chunks with a relative size smaller than 0.3 here, as you can see, the chances of the frame rates dropping below 30 are significantly reduced. Okay, reduce small bodies. So for chaos solver, smaller bodies are more challenging to handle. They increase computational complexity and they are more prone to jittering. It is important for us to really think it through whether to keep it in our simulation. Can we just use some mesh particles to fill in the blanks, or can we give it a lifespan and remove it timely? And Unreal provides tools for doing all that. First, the tiny GU to filter out the small chunks based on their relative volume and merge them with neighboring large chunks. And the removal tool allows us to set a time window for each chunk and simply kill it after breaking apart for a while. And in my test scenario, I use the interact select tool to filter out the smaller chunks and set a removal time on them. And as you can see, the remaining debris on the ground has reduced, and the frame rate can recover much faster. So the large number of chunks landing on the ground can also cause performance spikes in these destruction effects. You probably already noticed that I always have a sleep field placed just above the ground. It sets a custom velocity threshold for chunks inside and putting the slow-moving ones to sleep. And this means the solver doesn't need to update them until they collide again, and it helps reduce jittering. And besides sleep, we have another option, which is to completely disable them, meaning that they will never be involved in collisions again. And if you don't need your chunks to pile up on the ground and to be reactivated at some point, I think disabling them might be a better choice, and it certainly performs better. Okay, let's summarize the optimization part. We've talked about setting up clusters, optimizing your collision proxy, reducing the smaller bodies, and putting them to sleep in time. All of that are centered around two aspects of rigid body simulations. One is limiting the number of active bodies. I emphasize active here because most of the time, limiting the total chunk in a geometry collection asset during production isn't that important. It's the active ones that matter. The other crucial aspect is limiting the collision context we need to consider. You can ask yourself this question during production, given different class level or given different objects, how accurate does my collision really need to be? Is there still room for simplification? And does a chunk need to participate in collision calculation all the time? We should like disable or remove them whenever possible. Okay, so this is the last part of my presentation. I want to introduce some workflow improvement we have made in 5.4. I've talked about how to author and edit a geometry collection in the fracture mode. They have this amazing set of tools in the fracture mode, but still it's a tedious job to go through each asset, fracture it, cluster it, and so on. Actually, this process can be automated and batched. You can do it once for all through our data flow graph, which is a framework for configuring physical assets procedurally. Here, I'm using the blueprint utility to iterate through all the static meshes in the scene, convert them into geometry collection, and run the same data flow operations on them. And then they are ready for simulation. Oh. Do you guys already seen that? Okay, so the data flow is a node-based graph that allows for non-destructive workflows. This is essential if you are a small team or you need a fast turnaround. And it's not limited to a destructive system only. We also use it to configure panel close and chaos flash, but let's focus on destruction here. I recommend setting up different procedures for different materials. And here is my recipe for all the wooden assets in my projects. It starts with converting source meshes to a geometry collection, then connect to a Voronoi fracture, build the cluster hierarchy, and generating collision proxies. So if anything changes, say if I want fewer chunks or a coarser collision, I can simply just change one node and reevaluate. No need to edit each asset individually. But I must say this feature is still in the experimental stage. We have a set of nodes that can perform the basic or the general operations. But for some specialized needs, you may need to create custom nodes in the native code. For instance, here, I used the trick I mentioned earlier. First, shrink the wood down and fracture it, then stretch it back. But since we are operating on a bunch of planks here, their orientations may vary. So I actually added some nodes to find the oriented bounding box of each piece, then do the trick. One more thing I want to mention here is in data flow, we can also set overrides for each geometry collection we operate on, allowing for more variations. So here in the action utility blueprint, I calculate the count of Voronoi sites based on each asset's volume and hook it up to the Voronoi parameter in the data flow. So in this way, artists can assign it by density instead by a fixed number and end up with uneven and unreasonable chunk sizes. Okay, so this is another big feature. If you have experience with other physical engines like PhysicsX or Havok, you might be longing for a visual debugger for chaos too. We actually have a beta version available in 5.4, and it can do so much more than just the chaos debug draws. You can record the state of a chaos simulation during gameplay, play it back in the debugger's editor, and really investigate what goes wrong at any given frame or even at any given sub-step. So a few words about Chaos Visual Debugger, or CVD for short. Currently, it supports recording data from the rigid body solver and the RBAN, rigid body animation node. And the data it can record includes various particle properties, collision data from every contact pair, joint constraints, and sync query infos. And within a frame, we take snapshots at each evolution step, which is called data channel. You should be aware that the CVD file can be quite large for a complex thing, so you might want to opt out some data by only activating the data channels you really need. Okay, so I listed some console commands I used throughout my presentation. They are pretty self-explanatory, and I know the chaos visual debugger is more of like really investigate what went wrong in your simulation, but you can also show some collision shapes and show the constraints in the editor and do some simple performance check using these stat commands. Okay, that's all I want to share today. Thank you.